By the way, everybody should have notes. We've had these notes for the last several weeks. We are on Genesis 4, and the title of that chapter is Lineages. Lineages. Okay? And that is Genesis chapter 4, the entire chapter. Does everybody have notes for that? If you do not, I have 3 full notes available. Lineages. It will look like so.
Oh, I don't.
Okay. All right, I got 2 more. Anyone interested?
Genesis 4.
Genesis 4, the entire chapter. It should say lineages. Okay.
I don't have that yet. I've only got this.
Okay. Does everybody have it? Do y'all have it?
I think you started this the world month. I did, I think.
That, what is that? Is that part of it? Okay.
On
you
the
got-
offense.
That's it? Yes,
The altar.
Yes.
because I already have my name on it.
Okay. Anyone else?
You passed these out that week.
I thought I had it, but I didn't, thank you.
Try that. We should, okay. All right. Let's go through it very quickly, and this is just a quick review. Verses 1 through 2, we saw the offspring of Adam and Eve. They began to procreate, multiply, and replenish the earth. We see in the latter part of verse 2, we are introduced to Cain and Abel, the offspring, which we see their occupations. One is a shepherd, one is a farmer. And then the next one we see verses 3 through 5. We see the offerings. So there's Cain, there's Abel. They had 2 different offerings. Cain offered the fruit of the ground, which symbolizes the works of men, which God rejects. And then Abel's offering was the shed blood of the animals, we assume sheep. And then that was deemed to be acceptable. So that's where we're introduced to the blood sacrifice for the remission of sins. And then we moved quickly on from that to where we are, no, that's last week. The objection, where we see that Cain is angry, his countenance fell, his demeanor fell, his attitude changed. And so he was objecting to God's receiving of Abel rather than himself. And then we see verses 6 through 7, we see an opportunity that God gave Cain as in confronting him on due to the fact that God knew very well that his anger would increase to a very dangerous point, which of course leads us to the event that we are tonight. So you should be in chapter 8, you should be on Roman numeral 6, which is the offense. The offense. Look with me in verse 8. It says, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." Okay? I want you to see 2 things about that event that took place, one of which is the festering of sin. Now, God had already confronted Cain about that anger that he had, that bitterness that developed, and that he needed to literally get over it. Now, when you're angry, is it easy to just get over it? No, it's not easy, but is it possible? So what Cain was incapable, obviously, of doing was backing up, reasoning through the situation, evaluating the whole thing, seeing it from God's perspective, and trying to understand what was going on here. Out of anger, he was acting irrationally. When we get angry, don't we act irrationally? It's like reality has left the building, right? When people get angry, they literally lose their mind. Do you know that each and every one of us that's where y'all have heard that we all walk a fine line between sanity and insanity, right? Y'all know that, right? So, think about this. When anger sets in, you're as close to it as you're going to get, okay? So, you either go over the edge, go too far, blow it in some degree, or you'll be able to pull back and get a handle on it. You and I have to deal with that stuff. So, we see in the case of Cain here, he's talking with his brother there in the field, but all along there is the festering of sin. How many of y'all ever got a thorn or some kind of something like that, a splinter in your hand or something? Yeah, hey, I worked for this boss a year ago. I mean, a taskmaster and a half. We get a splinter in our hand, he'd say, hey, get it out on your time, mark it and take it out later, kind of thing. But anyway, what happens to the human body in such case, it festers, right? It begins to push it up, and what it is, it's infection, it's building up, and all of that. It's kind of like the illustration I put in your nose is a volcano. Okay, and by the way, this is an interesting thing. There's different scenarios of why America, in particular, is not highlighted in prophecy of Scripture. There's different sort of scenarios, or I guess you would say estimations of what that could be. They say that one of the things, for example, would be Yellowstone, the volcanoes at Yellowstone. They've put it out on a graph and out on a map, and that if Yellowstone were to ever blow, and it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. If it ever does blow, it is probably as much as 2/3 or more of the country would be affected. And they say that what's that dust, that stuff that it puts off into the air, spreads through the atmosphere and all that sort of stuff. They say inside that is those brown particles, those little particles that's in that people are breathing, is condensed glass. And that it would go into your lungs and severely damage your lungs, bringing upon death. So there are, anyway, that's just FYI, good old information as far as the prophetic potentials that are out there. But in regard to the volcano, people go to Yellowstone right now and they ooh and they ah, well, look at that thing shooting up and look at that steam coming up and all of that. It's a tourist attraction, right? But what's underneath is something that is festering, something that can potentially blow with absolute catastrophic consequences. That's what Cain was. He was a walking volcano. He was fixing to blow his top. And, of course, we see that he did. So we see the second part of this was the fulfillment of that sin, that, of course, the Lord told him that he was in danger of committing. Remember, sin is not just in the act, it is the preparatory time leading up to the act. The sin already began in the anger. It had already begun with the attitude. It was just fully manifested in the killing of his brother. Look there in verse 8 again. It says, And Cain rose up against Abel. That term there, rose up, is to lash out. He literally, in that anger completely manifested in a violent way. So it's like you, how many of y'all remember when our parents, when we were young and we was getting ready to get wore out, that they rose up to do it. And of course, that's it. That's just rising up in a hostile way. So look at there in verse 8 again. He rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. Okay? So what's going to come into play here is that instead of Cain loving his brother, we go into that aspect of brotherly love, he all of a sudden hated him. Okay? Now listen, we're talking about brothers here. We're talking about family, right? Does that still happen to this day? I mean, it's all lovey-dovey, and sometimes when things are good, it's lovey-dovey, but if you ever push the wrong buttons, you ever cross them, you could go get on their bad side pretty quick. And it does not matter. This whole blood is thicker than water thing. Oh my goodness, some of the worst enemies that you can have can be blood kin. Make no mistake. And listen, that's just a part of the whole demonic sphere, okay? And so notice here in verse 9, we're going to see Cain the obstinate. Look in verse 9, it says, "And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother?" Here again, God asking a question he already knows the answer of, right? What's he doing here? Time to own up. Time to confess. Time to make it right. Time to get right. Right? So when God,
Giving him a chance.
yeah, God is a God of chances. He is given a chance here. He could have confessed, okay, I'm coming clean, okay? But oftentimes that is not the case. Sinners in their sin will not come clean. They will not. They will take it to the utmost limit. So we see here, he asked, "Where is Abel thy brother?" Did the Lord know? Yes. And he said, "I know not." Now we do know that at this point, not only is Abel slain or killed by Cain, but he is also buried. Okay? So when oftentimes when a murder is committed, how do you cover it up? You bury them. You dispose of the body. Okay? Kind of like Hoffa, right? And still ain't found the guy. So they literally, he hid the body. Isn't it interesting? Back in early times, or in early man, they still do not realize that God is omnipresent and He's omniscient. He knows everything. He knows everything. He sees everything. Everything we do is not cloaked from God. Y'all know what I mean by cloaked, right? That is, of course, that being invisible or unseen. God sees everything. He knows everything. He knows every thought. He knows every deed. He knows every attitude. He knows every word. He knows it all. And we need to get over ourselves, as in the case of people all throughout human history, in thinking or believing that God doesn't somehow. But listen, oftentimes when we get caught up in life and get caught up in life's events and challenges and relationships and all of that, don't we oftentimes lose touch with reality that God's still watching and looking and seeing and all that stuff? You know, we're going into a time now we're all under surveillance. Do y'all know that? When you go to the gas pump, you're under surveillance. They're watching you. You go to the checkout, you're under surveillance. They're surveilling you. You go through the stop sign or the traffic light, you're being surveilled. It's a constant surveillance going on. Imagine this, is that you've got the unseen eye of God that is surveilling everything we do. It kind of helps you sort of line up and be a little more accountable, right? And listen, the time when I was in corrections, the inmates were a little bit more tame, and the corrections officers were a little bit more disciplined because they knew they were being watched. Okay? If we knew that we were being watched, it should modify our behavior a little bit, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you think? So we got to get into that mindset. And so notice here is Cain is a liar. Okay? So what's the next sin that comes after murder? The lie, the cover-up. So here he is, you notice in verse 9, he says, I don't know where he is. How many of y'all raise kids? When you're raising kids, guess what? They're liars. You can catch them in the act and they'll lie to your face that they did the act. Are you with me? And so you ask them what they did, I don't know. And so, I didn't do it, it wasn't me, and all that sort of thing. And then and if that doesn't work, they'll blame someone else. Okay? Exactly. It is a human condition that goes back to the fall, no doubt. So notice here, he's introduced here as a liar. So he's already a murderer, right? Now he's a liar, right? Now go with me to the Gospel of John in chapter 8. The Gospel of John in chapter 8. Now in this context, Jesus is talking to the most religious, pious people on the planet in that day, which are Pharisees. Okay? Scribes, Pharisees, the religious sect. And listen, Jesus was not worried about offending anybody. He told it like it was, and he didn't care where the chips fell. He just told them. And look in verse 44. Remember the audience that he's speaking to. He says, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning." We already saw that, right, in the act of Cain. And it says he was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. So the offspring of Adam and Eve had already developed the sin nature. Okay? And remember, sinners by nature, sinners by choice. Okay? Now, and so it turns out here that he is exposed, not just a murderer, but a liar. Now look at the next page of your notes. We see Cain the loather. Okay? And his loathing was not just for his brother Abel, but it was for God himself. Remember, Cain's anger was not necessarily completely upon his brother Abel, but rather upon God, and Abel was just in the way. He was just a part of the whole scenario. And so we're seeing his hatred not just for his brother, but for God himself in this next statement. He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It's not my day to keep up with him. Who am I? I mean, I'm not I'm not his guardian. I'm not his overseer. I'm not his parent. I'm not in charge of him. He's old enough to have his own business, his own life. He is literally showing his lack of fear of God and his disdain for God. Because God had rejected not just his sacrifice, listen, in God rejecting his sacrifice, he was also rejecting him because his sacrifice was insufficient from God's perspective. But he could have made that right and be accepted by God, right? He was given the opportunity and given the chance. And however, he refused his opportunity, he refused his chance, and there he is. He is literally being irreverent to holy God. And so if you imagine that is we know that, what does it say? I'm just trying to think of it off the top of my head. But anyway, the knowledge and wisdom begins with the fear of God, okay? And if you lack the fear of God, then of course that means that you are in opposition to God, you're enmity of God, and in fact, the case can be made that you actually hate God. Okay, now Jesus said that himself, right? He says, I'm not of this world, and I can prove that I'm just paraphrasing. I can prove I'm not of this world because the world hates me. Okay, they have nothing in me. So there is a natural hatred toward God and the things of God and the people of God. Why is Israel so detested in the world? Why are they persecuted? Why is anti-Semitism on the rise? Because of their attachment to God, God's affection toward them, God's covenant toward them. And even Satan hates the Jews. Why are Christians so hated? Because of our relation to God. Okay? And so we're just simply targets, and God is, of course, the one that they really hate. So here he is, he's being disrespectful, irreverent to God. And as in the case of sinful man, they too are irreverent toward God in many ways. Now look with me at the next one. We see the ostracized. That is, he becomes an outlaw, and he becomes an outcast. Okay? Now, let me do verse 10 here first to include in the previous text. It says, and he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Now look in verse 11 and see what God says to him. He says, and now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Now, look with me here in verse 12. The very first part, it says, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. Now remember, before the offerings were brought to God, we see that Cain is noted as a tiller of the ground. And that when he brought his offering, he brought the fruit of the ground. So we can surmise that Cain was quite prosperous and quite productive as a farmer. Everything was going his way. Everything was producing as it should. But notice here, he says that will no longer be the case. He will indeed go from being this skilled farmer or gardener, and he would become ultimately a convicted criminal. He would literally he would literally, the yield of what he once did would be no more. So what is happening with Cain is his life and his living and what he proposes he's going to do with his life, it's going to be completely changed. He's no longer going to be on the farm, and he's no longer going to be raising vegetables, and he's no longer going to be making a living in that way. His complete, I guess you would say, his trajectory in life had changed. Isn't that oftentimes what happens when people, go the wrong way? It completely changes the direction of their life. Do you know you can make a decision, and your decisions have consequences, right?
Right.
And it's like roads. It's like we're going down a road, and there's many like off roads. And so every decision we make is taking us down this path. But sometimes if we do something incredibly wrong, we will take a different path than what perhaps we would have been on. Imagine Cain if he would have stayed on the right path by heeding to God's admonitions and warnings, right? I would have avoided all of this, and I would have had the life that I intended. Well, oftentimes life changes, does it not, because of the decisions and the directions that we go. So he ultimately is an outlaw at this point. And then we see that he is also an outcast. Look in verse 12. He says, a fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. So this word here, you know what a fugitive, obviously, right? You're going to be on the run, okay? You're going to be a marked man, and I'm getting not the mark that he gives him to protect him, but a marked man in respect to his sin and his violence and the reputation that he will have associated to him. Okay, so he is, of course, an outcast. Notice it says he's a vagabond. You know what a vagabond is, right?
Wanderer.
Yeah, a wanderer. He becomes a nomad, right? He becomes he's literally on the run. He becomes a transient of sorts. He's nowhere ultimately to find peace or any kind of settlement on the planet. And so notice in your notes it says that in the banishment, he would be a desert dweller and a wanderer, and he would have to scavenge to survive. And so his company and companions would be notorious characters of a lesser sort as well. So he would, of course, remember, now Adam and Eve, they're procreating like rabbits. Okay, listen, that's not an understatement. They are having kids galore. The only reason certain ones are singled out in the Bible narrative is that they are important to the redemptive story of God. Okay? But we do know that when Cain and Abel came along, that there were a lot of other brothers and sisters coming along too, a whole bunch, and you'll see some that coming up here in a little bit. But look here at verse 12. It says, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. Okay? So not only has he been separated from his family and his life and everything that he once knew, but he also would be separated from God himself, which is incredibly worse than it all. And it says, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Okay? So he has literally become an outcast. He is an outlaw. He knows, and listen, this is why we know that the earth had already begun to populate, because he's already saying somebody is going to find me and kill me. There's people out there. You know, they're going to kill me. I find it interesting, isn't it just sort of the way of the world? He felt justified in killing his own brother, but then he did not himself want to be killed. Isn't it interesting that someone kills someone, they go on death row, they're assigned for execution, and all of a sudden they're trying to appeal themselves out of it. Right? Because they don't want to die. And so they take matters into their own hands, but they themselves do not want that upon them which they put upon others. Exactly. Now, we have to learn something about the Lord in this particular case. When did, and this is sort of a quizzitive question, when was capital punishment introduced in the Bible? Mm-mm. Where was the first place capital punishment was introduced in the Bible? Right after the flood. It was introduced to Noah and his family. There would be blood that was shed would be required. Okay? And so that's when, and so I said that to say this, is prior to the flood, back during this particular time, we know that man became very evil, they became very corrupt, and that God ultimately, in his sovereignty, was in one way holding back the wrath of man against themselves. Because make no mistake, without God's sovereign intervening hand, they would have butchered each other to death. It would have been, the world would have been filled with blood very quickly. So herein we see the reasoning here that, and listen, Cain is not given a pass. He is punished to the severity of his sin. And of course, we see here that he is protected by God in receiving a mark. Now, don't think that this is permission to go out and get you a tattoo. Are y'all with me? Oh my goodness. So, you know, a lot of speculation, you know, as to what this mark is. And listen, the fact be known, nobody knows. Okay? By the way, in my earlier comment, I'm not suggesting that getting a tattoo is the unpardonable sin.
It's hidden there.
Oh my goodness. It's crazy world out there now, y'all. I kid you not. But the fact is that God is restraining and holding back humanity from obliterating itself. Okay? Let me ask you this. Is God still doing that to this day?
Yeah.
Boy, oh boy, is He. You know what I'm impressed with about God in our time? Is that,
That he hasn't wiped us out.
Well, that's certainly a sign of His grace there and His long suffering on behalf of man. But the fact that Israel still exists when they're surrounded by their enemy and they no longer have any allies, and God is the only one on their side. And He is preserving. Listen, you guys, we are observing a modern day miracle right before our eyes.
Yes.
They will not touch them because God will not let them touch them. Okay? So God still has, listen, this replacement theology is heresy. Okay? Meaning that the church has not replaced Israel. Israel is very much still in the economy and the redemptive purpose of God. Okay? He will revisit them in His covenant and fulfill everything that's promised to them. Okay? And so we find here that He is protected by God Himself. And if you notice, if anybody dare slay Cain, there will be vengeance. Vengeance from who? Vengeance from God. Let me ask you this. Is the justice of God vengeance? Yes. Is the justice of God, and you think of it in terms of wrath and vengeance, is that vengeance is the,
He does say vengeance is mine.
Yeah, He says vengeance is His. He will bring vengeance and He will avenge. Do y'all know what I mean by avenge? You and I will one of these days be vindicated. You know, all these people that's hated you, persecuted you, all these sort of things, the martyrs have been put to death. Do you remember in Revelation the martyrs under the altar calling out to God, when and how long, Lord? And ultimately until God would pour out His vengeance, pour out His wrath. And so notice here, it would be, the vengeance of God would be poured out. How much? Why would you think it would be that reference sevenfold?
It's the complete, isn't it? It's the complete fulfillment
Yeah.
of God.
Yes, divine perfection. What God was saying, that they would be punished to the maximum degree.
I have a
Okay?
question.
Yeah.
That has always bothered me. Now, God put a mark on him. Was it part of grace, His grace? I mean, He could have just let him kill him, but He put a mark on him. And Cain was afraid, but yet he went to God about it. They're going to kill me. And God said, no, they're not, because I'm going to put a mark on you.
Yeah.
What,
Yeah,
you wonder.
the mark was, of course, for his benefit,
Right.
okay, because he knew it was marked after the fact. But it was also a deterrent from others, right? If you think about it, and I'm not associating this to the seal that is received by the 144,000 in Revelation. But if you notice in Revelation, that 144,000 are sealed, and guess what that means? They're untouchable. That means that they're under the sovereign protecting hand of God. Exactly. Yeah. All right, guys. Now, if you would, bring back your notes next week. And we're going to see the dividing of getting into the lines, if you will.
May I read one verse I was thinking about in Romans?
Yeah, go ahead.
When people tell Romans, for example, it says here, for he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid.
Hey, just 1 second. She's reading this scripture, okay?
This is Romans 13, verse 4. This is the governing authority. For he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger, to execute wrath on him who practices evil.
Yeah.
In other words, it's even better, but I don't know.
Yeah, and you make a point and even in the text is that the wrath of man and civil punishment and the judicial system being meted out is within the design and the will of God. Exactly. Yes, sir.
You know, every time you turn around, somebody hates the Jews. And they are universally hated worldwide.
Mm.
Because, you know, I have yet to understand why worldwide they're hated, but they are.
People don't even know why they hate them.
They don't like being hated, don't like Jews. And
Yeah.
it's not a physical thing, it's a spiritual thing.
Yeah, it's spiritual nature, right?
Yeah.
Hey y'all, when we dismiss, be sure to put your chairs up on the table like this, okay?
You know, you
All right.
mentioned about the volcano. We watched the documentary. I don't know if anybody remembers this. Back in, I think, December 9th, 2019, they had that volcano in New Zealand. And they had a tour going up there. I forget how many people. We just watched it the other night. And what those people went through, because they're stuck on an island. The rescuers can't get there. It's an hour and a half away. And the glass and all that stuff they're breathing, but they were literally sitting around this building, and that was amazing.
Wow.
You know, it's awful stuff.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and dismiss in a word of prayer. Father, bless us as we go to our respective homes, as we travel. Be with our families, be with the needs mentioned tonight. Be with us, Lord, as your church. May we be found faithful in the truth of your word. And we thank you for the blessings of your salvation. For we ask in Jesus' name, amen.